Welcome back to Think Design Work Smart. I'm Alex Bolboaca and coming to you from the Mozaic Works studios. It's time for another chat with somebody interesting from software development, and my guest today is Amitai Schleier. Amitai is an independent consultant, coach, and trainer who has done work around legacy systems and who is known for a bunch of things: a podcast of 3 minutes episodes about Agile, a coding tour, and PubMob, a tool for remote development. But we are here to learn much more about him in this open conversation. Welcome, Amitai.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex.
It's a pleasure. So the first question that I like to ask my guests is, how did you end up in software development? What made you join this industry?
I got lucky a bunch of times, is how. Ultimately, it's lucky because it's the work that I think is best suited to me. There are other things that I could do, but they're less practical, and I wouldn't live as comfortably if I was doing them. And there are other things I could do that are less creative and less fulfilling, but I wouldn't be as creative or fulfilled. So I got lucky. And then how? A bunch of ways. First of all, in elementary school, there were computers in the school. So if I was able to complete some schoolwork quickly enough, I could get sent to the library, and there was an Apple II there. And that was really the beginning. You could hit a keystroke and you get into a command prompt, and I don't know what's going on, but I'm in it. I'm doing something. That was the beginning. And then we were lucky we got a computer at home a few years after that. It was a Mac Plus, and I can tell a fun story about that later. We had it around. We didn't have a lot of onlineness. So everything that I had, I didn't have a lot of books. I didn't have a lot of connections to anything. There was no community that I was aware of in my area that was doing what I was doing. We did eventually find a Mac user group, but that wasn't the same as a programming user group. And then I just, a long series of more fortunate things that kept happening. We could keep going. Should I keep going?
Yes, why not? I've recently watched a talk of yours, and you mentioned that you have a music degree, which is always fascinating to me, that people have degrees other than software development and end up with doing programming and software development. So how did that happen?
It's not exactly an accident. It is true. I do have more training in an academic sense in music than I do in software. All my software training came pretty much on the job, and that's part of how I got lucky. We can double back to that. But the music degree was, to begin with, unintentional. When I was in high school, I was already a musician, and I was playing the piano, and I loved it, and I didn't want to practice very much, and I was worried that my love for it would be taken away if I worked too hard on the technical aspects, which is an interesting thing to consider in retrospect, the way that my love for software depends on the technical aspects. But in music, I was afraid, because I had seen it happen, that the love would be bred out of me by exercises. And I would rather be less skilled and more loving than more skilled and less loving for music. I didn't want to lose it. So I was presented with a challenge about that, which is that for a university that I applied to, I was applying for computer engineering, because that's what I really thought I wanted to do, and English, because I thought I wanted to write. And as part of that, I applied for a scholarship for some of the tuition that was about some artistic endeavor. And I submitted a tape with a few pieces that I had recorded. I think Debussy, Beethoven, and Rachmaninoff or something like that, maybe Brahms. And on the strength of an audition that I did for them, they accepted me as a music major, even though I didn't want to be one. I remember the ramifications of that are they assigned me a music advisor from the music department, when what I wanted more than almost life itself was to get into the intro to computer science class, which was very full at this engineering school. And my music advisor was no help. He had no connections. He had no way to like slip one more guy in. And he was saying, well, you know, you're lucky because it's easier to take the music requirements and then later decide that you don't want to be a musician or a music major than it is to not take them and later decide that you do want to be a music major. And I was saying, look, man, I was 18. I never want to be a music major. Foreshadowing. So just I don't know how this happened. None of this is right. I'm sure you're a nice person, but I'm trying to go that direction. Can you help me with that? And he was like, no, sorry. I'm unable to. I'm structurally unable to. So I had a frustrating experience at that university. And for a variety of reasons, that was only one. There were a variety of other reasons to do with the state that I was in. I kind of flamed out from that university. Many years later, when I was reconsidering what I wanted my life to look like, I realized that I had basically an epiphany, as much of an epiphany as I can imagine having. It was a very clear vision. Nothing in my life was right. A relationship had ended. I was living in a city that I had vowed to get out of, and I had gotten out of it, and then I had come back. And I was in it again. And then a job had ended. And just many of the things that I had loved as a kid were not part of my life anymore. Chief among them, music. And I just thought, none of this is right. This is a free invitation to reconsider my direction. Let's reconsider it. What would be right? And it occurred to me in a flash of insight that if I shuffle off this mortal coil and I have not left behind a stack of music that I created, I screwed up. Oh, well, I haven't been playing the piano for 7 years. Okay. Am I ready for the university again? Because I wasn't ready for it last time. I guess so. And then this is another place where I got lucky. So at this point, I was already involved in an open source project called NetBSD, which is an open source operating system. And through that, there were people that I knew online that whenever I would visit a place that had some of those people, I would try to meet with them. And I was in New York visiting my sister and meeting up with a couple of NetBSD folks who were in the area. And I was explaining to them that I'm applying to college, but it's a bit strange because I'm 25 and there are two forks in that path. Either you're a first-year student coming straight from high school, and your academic path has been pretty clearly supporting your application for this university. And if you're lucky, they'll see that and they'll let you in. Or you're a transfer student. You're older, you've been at some other university, and you'll have a relationship or two for a letter of recommendation and enough of an academic success at that university to go to this other one. Neither of those were applying to me. I was 7 or 8 years out of high school. And I was also a bunch of years out of trying college and not having anything good to say about it. And so for each university that I was looking at, which were a little bit higher echelon than I had been in before, it was kind of a one-off for each of them. I would call the admissions department and say, this is me. Which way of those two should I apply? And they would say, dartboard, you go that way. And it didn't feel like they were institutionally aware that there were people like me who were really trying to learn. In New York, I met with an NetBSD developer who said, oh, well, do you know about the School of General Studies at Columbia? And I said, no, what's that? He said, I'm a student there. And this is a friend who's a few years older than me. And you can get an undergraduate degree there as a non-traditional adult student for a variety of reasons. And that's what I qualified for. And so this is a place that it proved to be 100% correct for me. And just on the off chance that I mentioned it to somebody that I happened to know from a project that I got involved with, that I happened to get involved with because in high school, when I was a fanatic about Texas Instruments graphing calculators, because you could program them, then there became a small project that a few of us put together, ticalc.org, on a Linux machine, and I knew nothing about Unix. I just had a Mac. And one of them said, oh, well, if you have this Mac, you could run NetBSD. And that turned into me going to the right university and meeting my wife and getting an amazing job out of college the second time where I really learned XP for real. after I got my music degree. So that leaves a bunch of directions we could go.
It's interesting to hear from people who have different degrees, because one question that comes up for me that I find very interesting is, did your music interest influence the way you learned or write software or learned software development?
The short answer is it has to. And then the tricky part is, to what extent am I aware of it? That's what I think. One thing I noticed when I was in school taking music classes, one year I was taking a counterpoint class, which is in Western art music and classical music. Counterpoint is the idea that there can be more than one melodic line unfolding at the same time. And if you follow certain rules, the rules of counterpoint, you can hear them both at the same time, moving independently. And your ear could choose this one, or it could choose that one, and they would both sound clearly with these rules. So I was taking this class, and at the same time, I was taking an advanced math class where we were proving everything this week that we would need to write our proofs for next week. That was the homework. And I noticed that I got better at doing the math homework, I think because of the counterpoint homework. Something about the counterpoint homework in some sense was much easier. The rules are stated and there are fewer of them, and it's much easier to check them. You could imagine automating it, actually, as a software person. But it put me in a frame of mind to be rigorous that I was not normally in. And then when I came to the math, I was ready in a way that I wouldn't have been. And so that, like in the moment, I noticed. Now, in a bigger sense, is there a connection between my musical studies and the effect of my software practice? It's hard to say. I do have an affinity for improvisation in music. And I think as a coach, that's the root of what we do. You don't get to orchestrate very much. You might get to say, like, who's in the orchestra, and there might be sort of a theme of what we're playing together about. But after that, it's improvisation, which doesn't have to be a very meaningful statement. I mean, everybody, every day, all the time is improvising. It's just that when you're not aware that you're doing it, it's less pressureful and it can be more natural. And when it's in a context that you're less comfortable, then it's more pressureful. And as a coach, we have to show up and improvise with whatever's there. And so I think there must be some connection between my proclivity in one and my proclivity for the other. I know, like, a lot of coaches and trainers like to have prepared material and then they leave a little room to deviate from it. And for me, that's among my least favorite things. I would much rather show up with a time box and figure out together how we spend it. And whenever a question comes up, talk about it just enough and then try to finish the thing. So it says a little bit about me and maybe a little bit about the music also.
So to go back to your first experiences with software development, what was your first programming language, or the history of your programming languages, if we could go through those?
Yeah, very first would have to be the BASIC on the Apple II. I guess it's AppleSoft BASIC. I remember writing an infinite loop with an echo or a print statement in it. I think we've all done that. I don't remember what more I did. I think I figured out about getting input from the user, and that's about it. Programming in a sense that I was like, I'm doing programming and I want to be doing programming and I want to be doing more powerful programming. I remember with the Mac Plus, the language that we were able to get for that was also a BASIC. It was Microsoft Quick Basic for the Macintosh. I think had it been Think C or Turbo Pascal or one of the other options for the Mac, I probably would have been overwhelmed. Instead, I had Microsoft Quick Basic and wished that it were more powerful. And I think that's probably like with the piano, I wanted to keep the love and not be overwhelmed by technique. And so it worked out that way. The story with Quick Basic that really cemented for me that whatever discipline this is, I should do more of it, was in high school with the Mac Plus. I love this story. It gives me goosebumps just to think about telling it. So I'm going to tell it. In high school, like many math nerds, I was fascinated with fractals. And the Mandelbrot set is a beautiful thing. I did not begin to understand, and still don't, what all there is to study about it. Just that it's beautiful and it's made out of math. And if I write a program, I can have it. And so I did the naive thing. I opened up Mandelbrot's book and I transcribed his algorithm into Quick Basic. It's a nested for loop. You go pixel by pixel. And the algorithm is roughly that you square a complex number and you do it some number of times. And if it ever gets bigger than the absolute value of 2, then it's not in the set. And if you finish the number of times that you said you would do and it's less than that, then you say that it probably is in the set. And then you make it black if it's in and white if it's out. And if you do this for every dot, then you end up with a picture that's like that snowman on its side. And that took my Mac Plus 9 hours to draw. There was no visible progress. It was just that watch cursor that doesn't turn. It did move, so the computer wasn't probably frozen, but there was no visual indication of anything happening. I didn't know that it was going to be 9 hours. It could have taken 12 years as far as I knew, but then it finished after 9 hours and there's the picture. And so I thought to myself, first, I mean, cool. That's what I wanted to see. I just wanted it to be a little faster, you know? And like the people who are researching this, whatever it means to research this, they're doing it in color. I don't have color. That's actually a plus in my situation because the compute power on this thing is so meager. It's good that I don't have a lot of pixels on the screen, and it's good that they can only be black and white. That saves me some. But I can't imagine that they're waiting hours between, because after you've gotten the picture, what you want to do is pick an area of the picture and zoom into it and see what changes. And by definition, as I understood it, the more you zoom in, the more iterations you have to do to get an accurate picture. And so it's only ever going to get slower than this to zoom in. That sounds not fun at all, which is not what I came here for. So how can I make this fun for me with the constraints that I have? What's interesting about this set? It's not all the points on the inside. If you zoom in on that, it's just black. What's interesting is the boundary. And if you zoom in on that, it gets more and more interesting. So what if, and also what's time consuming in this process? It's actually not the points that are outside the set, because you can stop early as soon as you see that they're running away. You don't have to do the full number of iterations for those. Those are the fast ones. The slow ones are the ones that are in the set that you have to do whatever number of iterations you said you're going to do to be sure. So if I could leave as many of those out as possible, this would go a lot faster. And if I could just trace the boundary somehow, like start on a point that's known to be on the edge and just dance my way in and out and up and over and just not go too far in any direction and make sure I keep crossing the boundary and tracing as I go, then that could be a lot faster if I could figure out how to do that. And so I don't remember the process, but I remember that I ended up with a program that did do that. And it took 12 minutes to run and I could watch it go. I could see a trace.
Oh, yeah.
It's still slow, but it's 45 times faster.
Big impact.
And it was fun.
Yeah.
And so I said, I don't know what field or discipline this is, but that was awesome. By thinking about what I needed and my own constraints and the problem, I could make it fun and I could get further with it. And whatever this is, I should do more of it.
All right. And about the technical practices, so I think you mentioned XP already. When did you first started learning about unit testing, test-driven development? And how was it for you? Because I know many people have troubles learning these techniques. And so it's always interesting to learn how it happened for us.
Yeah, I learned it, again, a lucky thing. Before I flamed out at that first university, I did manage to take the Intro to Computer Science class the second semester that I was there. And the teaching assistant was a student who was actually a year younger than I was. but he was further along in a lot of ways. And on one of the assignments, which was ask the user for a number and then give the prime factors, I had done an optimization on the for loop to make the problem interesting for myself. I realized that if you're taking the factors out as you go, then you only have to go as far as the square root of the number. You don't have to do a for loop up to the number itself, because once you get up to the square root, every multiple on one side of the square root must have a corresponding multiple on the other. And so I did it that way, even though it doesn't matter when you put in a number from 1 to 100. It made it fun for me so that I could finish it. And he took note of it because he was convinced that he had seen every variation on this solution under the sun, but he hadn't seen mine. And so he kept an eye on me. He said, this guy doesn't really have it all together, but there's something going on there. Let me see what he turns into. And after, we kept in touch, we became friends. He was already working full time at a software company as he was in college. And after about a year of my working for a .com, he gave me a quick informal interview and decided that he was going to take a risk on me. That he, as a person who bore himself responsibly and had a positive reputation in this company and was a grown-up already in a way that I certainly was not, was going to risk his name on having me come in and having him teach me. And so I learned all this stuff at the same time. And to your point, it was too much. It was too much for me. I understood some things about it, but I did not internalize it. As a coach, one of the things that I have to work around is the fact that I never had a software job the old way. The company that he hired me into was an XP shop. They actually had Ron Jeffries come and visit at one point just to make sure. I don't remember how that went. I wasn't aware enough of what was going on. But yeah, I was taught Java, I was taught object orientation, I was taught test driving, I was taught pairing. We did all this stuff all the time. And it had a huge impact on me, but the details, it was too much. I was still trying to figure out how to write the code to solve the problem. And I also have to think about how to communicate it, and I also have to think about how to test it, and it is too much. But what imprinted on me, besides all that, is I was on a team of people who were smart people. And at that age, the lesson I needed to learn more than anything else was that it does not suffice to be a smart person, whatever that is. For me, I had been coasting on that and then running into the wall, and coasting and running into the wall, and coasting and running into the wall. And what I saw from these people, they were smarter than me because they were plenty smart and they knew what else was required besides that, which is to pay attention to yourself, pay attention to your work, notice where the mistakes come from, notice where the slowdowns come from, and systematically, little by little, whenever you notice one, change something a little bit to make it less likely next time. And 1 out of every 15 things they did made sense to me, but the pattern I for sure understood. And that was a huge, important life lesson for me. And then years later, when I finished the music degree and I got a software job and I found myself in trouble, the first thing that came to mind was, I learned a bunch of stuff from Nathan years ago, and I feel like a lot of it would help me right now, but what's the first thing that would help me right now first? TDD. I think I need to relearn TDD. And that's what got me started for real on this path.
So how was it when you tried to relearn test-driven development? I think I've heard you telling this story before, that you were working on a product that was kind of an internal product, but very important, or became very important in time, and you wanted to make sure that it's actually working, and that's how you got back to TDD. But I'm more curious about the details. Was it easy in the beginning? Were you writing the wrong tests, or how was it?
Well, I'm trying to, I don't have a clear memory of the first time when Nathan was teaching me. I'm sure we were writing tests that were overly detailed and overly constraining or missing something important, guaranteed, just because we were so overwhelmed. The more recent time when I kind of paged in from memory that this is the technique that I have to acquire now. Over time, while I was there, we wound up with upwards of 100,000 tests, not all of them unit tests, not all of them micro tests. But for the most part, it wasn't the case that they were overly coupled. Every now and then we would find a case where you change something and an existing test fails and oops, it shouldn't have, let's decouple it from that detail. But mostly not. So I'm sure there were, I wish I remembered more clearly. I'm sure there were growing pains. I'm sure my tests were too integrated to begin with. I wish I remember what made me push it down toward micro. I mean, we kept integration tests, we kept some performance tests that weren't even binary, but the bulk of them were tiny and fast. And I wish there wasn't a teacher with me at the time. It was just me trying to keep my nose above the water. It would be really interesting if I knew the answer.
And so you also mentioned pair programming. How was it for you in the beginning to try pair programming, or, you know, was it weird? Was it something that you expected from development? Is it something that's
no,
also...
It was super weird.
It was weird, right?
Yeah, I mean, I got, like so many of us, I think one of the things that attracted me to computing as a young person was to take a break from people and to get into my own mind and to not have to convey about it other than to the machine. And I found when I was first introduced to pairing, I didn't think I had any mental bandwidth to spare for that. Programming was hard enough. So that's something that I bear in mind when I'm suggesting to people that they do this. It's a whole other thing your brain has to keep track of, and by itself, it might be too much. But then at the same time, as by far the most junior developer there, I noticed how much it helped me. It helped me remember, because there was another person there, it helped me remember, what are we trying to do again? Because we're bouncing up and down levels of abstraction. Where are we going with this? When can we commit it? When can we ship it? And it helped me to know ways to do things, because when I was stuck for how to program it, I could at least say what my intention was and get some help from somebody who would know how. So there were pros to it, but the main thing I remember about it is that it was exhausting to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's a very common challenge when starting. I'm curious, did you do any kind of musical improv in a group or only by yourself?
Only by myself. It's a major missing spot in my musical background. I've played written pieces that were rehearsed and played together with groups, chamber pieces, orchestral pieces. I've improvised, but only by myself. And this is going to sound crazy. I don't know jazz. I would really like to know about jazz. I lack the harmonic language because I was not raised with it. And so when I hear classical music, my ears know how to parse the grammar and find the patterns and make sense of it because I have so much practice. And with jazz, I can tell that I'm not parsing the grammar and I'm missing what's going on because I have an expectation for what it's like to listen to music that I'm not fulfilling. I haven't been trained. And so you would think an improviser with a piano is going to be doing some jazzy stuff. I would love to, but no. And I also, again, I would love to improvise with other people and notice the back and forth and be able to fill. That requires a real level of comfort and skill. I have that in software. I would have to work toward that in music.
Right. To be honest, I know very little about music. I mean, I love listening to all kinds of music. I grew up listening to classical music, and I know a lot about that. I recognize the pieces, and I love rock, and I love jazz, and I love some rap, and so on. But playing music, this has never been my spot. So this makes me really curious about how it relates to software. And on this note, it's also, I'm curious if the disciplines that you learned, if you are more disciplined due to music, or, well, what do you think?
I have been reflecting a lot on my musical practice lately because I have been doing a lot of musical practice lately. I just kind of ended a phase of a project that is a totally new thing to me musically, which is that my mother was having a surgery in May, and music with the piano is one of our love languages. And I thought one of the things I can do is if I could just record a little piece, a miniature every day and send it to them, that would help her with the recovery and the rehab. And it would be nice for me. And my kids will hear music in the house every day. And it's just, until I get back to work, this is a fun little project. So for 5 months, just about every day, just about, I never went 2 days that I missed, only one day every now and then. I would record myself at the piano playing a piece as well as I could learn it pretty quickly. And so nothing was less than 50% good. And a lot of them, you could hear what this piece would sound like if it were played well. And that was my goal. You can imagine the value of this music from hearing it from me, and maybe you want to go find a real recording. And at the end of it, I have 5 CDs worth of music. It's almost 6 hours, 127 pieces. And I practiced sight reading a lot. One of the limiting beliefs I had as a kid is that sight reading is an aptitude, and I lacked it. And so I would really struggle with new pieces. I would have my teacher mediating the experience of discovering new music. He would say, I think you would like this Debussy prelude and you could probably play it. Let me just play a little bit of it for you. You think you want to learn that? And then after about 5 really painful readings, I would have it memorized, and I would close the book and work on what my hands are doing. And this was really a limiting belief. I could never have imagined a future me where some of the music that I wound up playing on this daily piano miniatures project, I hadn't even heard before. Most of it I had, but partway through the project, almost accidentally, I was reading through some scores to see if they would be good for the next couple of weeks, and realized that I was playing some that I didn't recognize, but this is what they sound like from my hands, and it sounds okay. That must be it. I never could have imagined that I could meet music by putting my own hands to it before my ears ever heard it. Usually I would hear a recording and I would have a target, and I would know when I was getting to sound like that or not. And for some of these pieces that I did in the last months, the first time I heard them was the time that I played them. Blew my mind. So is there a connection to the discipline, was your question. I think I noticed my discipline with music has grown. My ability to have discipline with music has grown quite a bit since those impatient early years. I don't get excited about doing finger exercises, but I'm starting to see why I would want to. Technique is starting to get more and more relevant to me as a pianist, and less forced. And I no longer feel like my love is at risk, which is kind of enabling to know that. And I do think that there is some connection there, because the same thing with software. As a young programmer, I was a perfectionist, still am, but I'm in recovery. And one of the things that got me in recovery was TDD, which freed me from having to have a finished design and being able to hold it all in my head, which in practice, I couldn't. The designs were never quite right, and I could always lose track of them. And so the thing that freed me in software was the idea that if I ask my code one new question at a time, and I make sure that it keeps answering the old questions the right way, this is perfection. It's perfect at doing everything I've ever asked it to do. And if there's something more it's supposed to do, I'll ask it that. And then I'll make it perfect that way too. And that just freed me from this miasma of having to be entirely in my head and entirely right, and replace it with technique. So there is a connection here. I'm struggling to articulate what it is, but I notice as I become more seasoned, hair-wise and otherwise, that my interest in the discipline aspect of it grows. I was very opposed to those things when I was young. And now that I'm where I am now, I find how much they lift up my practice.
Right, that makes sense. I'm asking also because when I first got into contact with the software craft movement, there was always this comparison that you never play on stage without practicing, and that this thing should apply in the same way to software developers, that when we are working on a commercial product in a commercial context, that's when you are on the stage, that's when you should be performing, but the practice comes before that. So practice should be separate from this. And practice would involve something that is repetitive, like finger exercises or things like that in music, but it can also involve different techniques and so on. And I'm not sure, have you been involved with the software craft movement in any way?
Gently, kind of glancingly, and in ways that were really important to me. The term itself doesn't ring the bells in my head as that's something that I want to rally around, but the people that I've met through it are. So that's the conundrum for me. The first time that I met software craft, I was in that job where I had finished my music degree. I got myself in trouble, and then I was learning XP, starting with TDD. And as part of that, I was looking around because nobody in my company that I could see was doing anything like this. And I was trying to convince myself that I wasn't crazy. I was looking for a community. And I found that there was a Software Craft North America conference. This was 2013, maybe. It was in Chicago, and my family was there. And so I thought, I'll see my folks and I'll go to this conference and see how I feel after that. And the way I felt after that was, oh my God, these are my people. Where were they? Why are none of them at my workplace? That as far as I can tell. And why is it the case that we have to find each other in this way? But thank God that we can. So that's one. It just kind of cemented that I'm not alone. There is a community. It's called this. Look for it. There was a practice in New York too, and I met some fine people here from that. And then a big way that it impacted me is when I went on that coding tour, the summer of 2018. We were in Germany for the summer anyway, and I was legally not going to be allowed to make any money because I was on a tourist visa for more than 90 days. And so I thought, this is a fun chance. I've always read about, Corey Haynes, Nicole Rauch, Sal Freudenberg. So many people have done this. This is my chance. It's my time to do this. Let's do this. And we also thought, we're going to live in Germany for a while pretty soon. Maybe this leaves me with some connections to the community that I can get better work rather than worse work when we live there. So I just put out a shingle and I said, I'm available to visit your company for a week. Hopefully in Germany, but really anywhere in Europe. And as long as you cover the expenses, I will gladly be with you, and I'll learn whatever you have going on, and I'll share whatever I can. But this is distinct from consulting, and it was really refreshing how distinct it was from consulting. The kinds of companies that will invite you to visit for a week for this are very, very different from the companies that will haggle over a contract and invite you for a year or whatever it is that they can manage to do. And so it was fun to be with companies that are willing to try something like that. It says something about how they are already. I learned a ton. I forgot the question. I got carried away.
It was about your involvement with software craft, and so you ended up with doing the tour,
yes. So as part of the tour, the craft community is part of what made that possible. People shared that I was available. I was able to go to the Socrates conference at the end of the summer. And so I was able to wrap up what I had done with people who knew very well about it. I was also able to go to the Agile Coach Camp conference at the beginning of the summer in Germany. And so just by the end of it, I did have those connections with craft. And Socrates in particular does not compare with the conference that I went to in Chicago. apples and oranges, night and day, whatever idiom you want. Software Craft North America was presenters on a stage, and we listen, and then we confer about it afterwards, which is fine. But Socrates is really special. And every chance I get to say that, here's one, I want to say that. It's very deliberately and specifically inclusive. It's entirely participatory. It's designed for crafters to share anything they want with each other. And it's a really special environment that they make there. I had never been to anything like it, and I hope I'll be able to go again. So that also left an impression on me. If craft can be like that, then maybe it is for me. Maybe that is a word that I would rally around.
Yeah, I think culturally, from what I've heard, the communities in North America are very different from the European communities. Here you can go in any big city almost in Europe, and you can find such a community where they would do an evening kata, or they would do a co-retreat every now and in a while, or just meet and discuss a few things, but always in a very open manner, and always trying to practice or to share knowledge. And yeah, and this has led to conferences that are also very open, and to this, almost to the point that they are driven by participants, not by anybody else, not by organizers, not by, which is my favorite things about this. All right, let's talk about legacy systems, because I know you've done some work around this area, and I guess also some of your first projects have been around this area, right?
Yeah, I have lots of opinions. Yeah.
So how did you start with
what can we say?
Legacy systems?
I got thrown into one, is the easiest way to say it. Through my involvement with NetBSD, when I was at university in New York getting a music degree, on Thursday nights we had a beer night, and when I could go, I would go. And through that, I met some NetBSD developers who were working at a financial institution and in the IT security department. And they were on another level in terms of what they were able to think about and hold in their heads. They were world-leading experts in Kerberos, which is it's a security infrastructure. Active Directory is built on top of it, and you can also run it all by itself to manage users and machines and services authenticating to each other in a very secure, organized way. So they were responsible for the Kerberos installation at that bank. And they had observed that there was a workflow problem in the bank to do with, as a person, I have my Kerberos identity. As a computer, it has a Kerberos identity. Services also have to have distinct identities, for sure in production, but also in non-production, like a development environment. If I'm part of a team and we're running a development instance, I don't want it to run as me. I want it to run with the Kerberos credentials of some shared ID that is purpose specific to that service, that developers can control, that maybe managers can't, or operations can't if you're making separations, which they were. And likewise, when it runs in production, developers shouldn't be able to change the aspects of that ID. And maybe IT managers and operations can, just for example. In production, this was happening. They were making these IDs. In development, people were doing it as rarely as they could get away with because of this process problem, which is that it was hard to get done. There wasn't any way directly to do it. You had to figure out which part of the organization you're in, whether it has its own help desk to call. It depends which kind of computing platform you're on. And then good luck to you after that. If they had a run book and they followed it accurately, in 3 weeks, you may have an ID. And maybe they didn't miss a spot. And so there were a lot of incentives against doing that. Whenever you could get away with not doing that, you would not do that. And worse than the create case was the update case. If you needed to change something about this ID, there's no record of who is a person who's allowed to do that. And so the workaround for that is that you get some managing director to approve that you can make this change, which is not a good use of a managing director's time, and it's not a good way to manage the risk. It really doesn't answer the question. And so my friends, these Kerberos guys, one weekend at one of their apartments, wrote a proof of concept because they controlled a thin slice of the problem end to end, and they thought they could solve a thin slice of the problem end to end. And they did. They wrote a proof of concept in Perl, lots of copy and paste, client, server, Kerberos authenticated, that would let you, from the command line, if you were working in a particular slice of this problem, do it yourself. Either in a few seconds it would come back silently because it succeeded, it's a Unix program, or it would come back with an error explaining what didn't work right, and then you can try again. And this was a hit. People who were involved in that slice of the problem really wanted to have that. And then they would make IDs. They would actually do the more secure thing because it was easier than not. And so my friend said, there are a lot of business units. There are a lot of computing platforms. This code isn't good. This is like a 5-year life cycle, at least, of growing this to all the use cases that we can think of now, let alone the ones that we can't think of now. And we don't want our lives to be software product development. Who do we know that could maybe handle this? I don't know why they thought I could. I did not have a stellar software development background, but I guess from our beer conversations, they figured somehow I was capable of it, or perhaps, and they took a risk on me. So I came in there, and they had already provided this client application, the server application, this Kerberized netcat that it ran on top of that handled authentication. And there was a library for marshalling and unmarshalling the arguments from the client to the server. It was very manageable. And there was already a SQLite database, and there was actually already in the SQLite database a provision for the next feature that I needed to add, which is once these IDs can be created and managed, at some point an application ends its life cycle, and maybe we shouldn't delete the ID, but probably we should be able to disable it so it can't be used for authentication. So Amitai, welcome. Let's add disable to the features, and you ship that. So I did, and it worked, and a bunch of other stuff had broken in production. That's how I got into legacy code. And I realized, like, a lot of the code paths that I had broken, maybe if I'd been programming more recently, I wouldn't have made those mistakes. It was like SQL statements were missing a space, or some formatting problem. I couldn't exercise those paths because I didn't have Kerberos administrative power, and shouldn't. And I didn't have a few other root things that they had. It's good that I didn't, but that's the only way those code paths could be exercised, the way the code was written. And so all I did was guess and have them look at it and have them say, yeah, okay, seems right. And then we got ourselves in trouble. And so I remember the feeling that I had. It was really heavy, that I've just graduated college. I just got this apartment. Everything in New York is expensive. My college loans are expensive. This job was hard to get because it was 2009. There was a financial downturn. I'm lucky that I had one. And my immediate feeling is like, am I going to be able to keep this job? I don't know. Because that seems like it should have been easy, and I screwed it all up. Take a deep breath. Let's assume that I do keep this job. What will have allowed me to do that? One is to take a deep breath. Two is to think about, like we said before, what techniques would really help me. It would really help me if there were some automated tests so that I know what's supposed to happen, so that if anything changes, I find out while I'm doing it, and not when someone else tells me that the operations team is mad. That would help a lot. And so that was kind of the intro to legacy code. This is what we need to evolve. It's instant legacy code. They made it in a weekend on purpose that way, just to prove the concept, just like you do with any product to find if there's a product market fit. And there was. And then here I am, but without any legacy code skills and without any domain knowledge. And frankly, without that much practice at programming. I had never been that good at it to begin with. But I needed to be. And that's the situation I fell into.
Right. And I guess what helped you was Michael Feder's method, right? Right.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that at the time. I didn't know what I was working with was legacy code. I didn't know the term. I didn't know the literature. I just knew there's got to be a way for me to do this safely, to know what it does now, and then to be told when it's different. And luckily, I had the two domain experts there. They hadn't left. They weren't gone. And one of them worked with me to, I still remember the day he wrote a shell script that demonstrated an example life cycle of one of these IDs. And all of a sudden, the domain started to make some sense to me. And then also I had a shell script that could fail also. So this is the beginning. Now, granted, that's a very integrated test, and I'm not even sure I could exercise it the way that he could because of my permissions. Again, good. I shouldn't have those permissions. But it gave me some kind of expected, you could say, as opposed to me not knowing what to expect. And from there, what we did is we very carefully and manually and with each other's eyeballs refactored onto a newer version of the marshalling and unmarshalling library, where at the end of that, we had functionality matching, and we had convinced ourselves that it was behaviorally identical. But because of the way the new library worked, the concerns were totally separated. And the server object was really just a business object at this point that happened to be told to use this library to get its arguments. And so at the end of that, we had something that was microtestable. And from then on, what I was doing each time there was a new feature to develop, I would say, okay, what area of code is about to change? Is it covered by tests? Not yet. I'm going to write some. And then add some, change some to get the new behavior and make sure that I know what I'm expecting and that I got it, and then ship that. And so after about 6 months of that, we had the answer to the first question, is it already covered, was basically always yes. And then we got really fast.
Right. So this sounds like the typical story for people who got into legacy code. Did you enjoy the process of refactoring the code, of improving it?
Yeah, I think the part where I became, like, whatever day that was that I stopped worrying about my job, from then on, yes. Once I was sure that I had what it took and that I was going to be able to hack it in this job, and I was going to never screw up in production like that again, then yes, it was really enjoyable. It felt really good to be able to make tiny commits, even when there wasn't test coverage to speak of, to be able to make really mechanical tiny commits and make sure with the person who knew the most about it that as far as we know that there's no way that couldn't be the same, and then to manually check whenever we could, and then to get to the point where we don't have to live like that anymore is so exhilarating. To get to the point where you can just make a small intention, see that you don't have lived up to it yet, and then see that you have. It's a great way to go through life. And as a programmer, I had never felt, I went from feeling as incompetent as I ever had, a few months later, as competent as I ever had. And not just feeling that way, but I really was that way. It changed how I related to the code and to the business problem, to be able to work in that way.
And I imagine this relates to the training and the consulting and coaching that you do. You've probably seen a lot of legacy systems since. And as you said, you have opinions, so I'd like to hear them.
Sure. Well, the biggest opinion is that I love legacy code. It's proof that what we do matters and is valuable as much as we can prove it. You know, some of it is distorted market forces, but some of it is that things that we make with software really help people. And you can tell because they want to spend money on them. And so when there is code that is valuable, but it's hard to change, and my favorite definition of legacy code is valuable code that we are afraid to change, because it's not actually a property of the code. It's a property of the code and the people who have to relate to it. You could look at a code base and feel totally comfortable changing it because of things that you know. And I could look at a code base and feel like there's no way I can know whether this is safe. It's not about the code. It's about what we bring to it and our relation with it. And so I say legacy code is valuable code that we are afraid to change. And the thing to fix is that fear. Tests are a really good way to address that, but it's not the only way. It's just a really important way. But the fear is what has to go. And once it does, like it did for me, then what you have is something that we all wish for. This is code that has users. This is code that has customers. This is code with a feedback loop, where a lot of places developing software wish they had one. We have one. If we screw up, we'll know. And if we do something that reduces cost and risk and nobody notices, we'll know, right? And this is extremely rewarding to work with something that has that feedback loop. I think one of the things in Agile that is most often missed is that feedback loop with customers. And with legacy code, you never have to ask whether it's there. It's there. So I find it very rewarding.
Yeah,
that's one of the opinions.
Yeah, I also love legacy code. And I agree with you. This is how I present. And actually, I think one of the most common ways of dealing with fear is, change and pray. This is a very common way of dealing with fear that I've seen. But tests are much better. I'm curious, what other methods do you find useful with when approaching such a complex problem?
Well, I guess there's the technical aspects and there's the people aspects. Usually I'm brought in as a technical coach because that's what the people with the budget think they're looking for, and they're not wrong. It's just that 80% of the job isn't that. So it's good that we come to the table with our other skills too. Generally, what I'm looking for to begin with when I begin an engagement is that I have to form some kind of relationship with the people that I'm going to work with pretty quickly while their goodwill is still open. And for that, it depends what they think is important. So if there's a pain point that they've identified, but nobody can spare the time to, fix that flailing test that sometimes fails, or, whatever it is about the build process, I'll take that from them and I'll go off and do it and bring it back kind of as an offering, just to make it clear. The only agenda I have here is to make your lives more enjoyable as developers so that you can ship the business value that you're here for. And, if that was in your way, let me get it out of your way. That'll prove something, that I'm not here against you. And that I have not just the willingness, but the ability to help. And then you can see an example of that. And you have to do that pretty quickly, because once you've been there long enough, people have finished forming some kind of an opinion and it's harder to change. So I try to do something like that pretty quickly. After that, we have some back and forth. Once we have a relationship, I can ask people to try something on the basis that I have helped them. There's some reciprocity that I can count on. I don't try to ask too much, and I try to be really sure, especially with my first asks, that these are things that are worth for them to try. But that's how it starts. And then in terms of techniques that I think are especially valuable, one of them is to read by refactoring. And that's just, we're looking through some code for whatever reason. We weren't even trying to change it. We're just reading. Or maybe we do it as a dedicated activity for a small amount of time. But as we puzzle through what's happening here, extract things that say that. Variable names, method names, maybe even a class, usually not that much. But just like put the words that we struggle to come up with in there as code, so that the next time we're there, we won't have to struggle as hard. That's one. Another one with legacy code is, at least in languages where the IDE refactorings can be trustworthy, like statically typed languages with enough type information, you can rely on those pretty well. Then you don't necessarily have to test first to be able to make some changes, such as those read by refactorings. And then a third one that I really rely on is approval tests, which as a concept have existed for a long time. And there's a text test library by Jeff Beisch that has been around for a long time. And there's also approval tests in various languages by Llewellyn Falco and others. And the idea there is also very old. It's the idea of the golden master. But these tools add a lot to that. So besides getting your program to output something fixed that looks right, that is deterministic for a given input, that you can serialize to disk and compare against, approval tests automates that. You can also use these tools for related things like generating a combinatoric variety of inputs and saving all of those outputs. And so it can give you a way to cover the problem space, sometimes exhaustively, depending on the problem, with very little effort. And this is something that I think is often challenging for people in legacy code, is that the effort to write a test manually can be very high. And there's value in doing that once or twice to understand what we're up against, but there's not value in doing that 100 times. We want these tests to give us the safety as cheaply as we can. That's not the cheapest way. Approval tests can be a really cheap way. And then once we have the ability to change the code and know that it hasn't changed the behavior cheaply with those tests, we don't have to value those tests as highly when our code gets more modular. We can replace them with the micro tests we wish we had in the first place. But we don't have to struggle to make those micro tests out of a sense of virtue to begin with. There are tools that can help us fast forward to the part where we can do that easily. So approval tests are pretty big for that.
Yeah, I agree. And we actually had Llewellyn here on the channel as well. So you can watch his video as well, what he thinks. All right. Anything else that you'd like to share about your activity in training, coaching, consulting? Anything else that you focus on that is interesting, let's say, to people?
Right now I'm just happy to be having this conversation. I had been on parental leave for almost a year until a few weeks ago, and I've just gotten back to work. So I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude to be having a professional conversation with a grown-up after kids. It's really sweet to be talking about what I do professionally. What I had been doing, and what I will probably resume some of, is I've been running some meetups. One is the Jersey City Java user group that's been dormant for a year now, and also the Southern Connecticut Agile meetup, which also has been. I'll probably pick those back up. I really enjoyed bringing in speakers and giving them a stage and letting them be heard. And I'll probably get back to that. Another thing I had been doing that's also on hiatus is PubMob, as you mentioned, which is an effort that Jeff Langer put together. And there were a handful of us doing sessions, JB Rainsberger, me, Ken Pugh, a few others, Jeff himself, of course. And that was a pretty unique offering for individuals with a small training budget to get their own training and just join a mob on a subject matter with a code base that was interesting to them, a variety of learning opportunities in the form of an ensemble. And the one that I was doing, I did a couple. One was sort of a prepared learning experience that you could do once or maybe twice, learning about the Strangler application pattern, which I still hope for a nicer name for that someday. And the other one that really stuck was my Legacy Open Source Fridays, which every Friday we were working on an open source email server that I have helped to revive on GitHub. And we made a pull request that I think had 25 committers on it because it was a bunch of different mobs over a long enough time. Probably should have been a smaller change, is one of the things we retrospected on. We didn't think it was going to have to take so long. In the end, it wasn't big. It was just a lot to figure out. But if you look at the commit history on that project, it's suddenly like 5 times the number of contributors that it was before because of that one commit with that pub mob. And we did a few other ones also. And that was nearly every Friday for a year, sometimes twice. And I loved that. And pub mob is on hiatus, but I would love to find a way to get back to doing something in public like that. So we'll see. All right. I'm just getting back to work. We'll see.
That sounds very interesting. I guess it's time to move to our ending questionnaire. We have 6 questions that I like to ask everybody who is coming as a guest to these chats. And these are a surprise. I don't share them in advance because I find it's more interesting to have this conversation. The first one, if you could share a book that you liked and that you would recommend. It can be technical, but it doesn't have to be technical. So.
It is amazing for how much reading I do, how little of it is books. I don't feel good about that, but it is true. I'm trying to think of something particularly formative or particularly recent. There haven't been many.
If not a book, that any other material, that you're looking at. Yeah.
I'll give an unorthodox answer, I guess, because that's what's coming to mind. For me, when I was really trying to learn as much as I could about coaching to make the career change, the most valuable place that I found, granted this was a decade ago, was Twitter. It may still be the case, but I read so much Twitter. Whatever looked vaguely interesting, I would follow that person. If they had a link to something to read, I would follow that link and read it. If they used words I hadn't seen before, I would learn them and put them in my vocabulary so that whatever it is that coaches talk about, let me be aware of what that is so that if I ever have the chance to do it, they'll believe me and then I have a new problem. I got to try to do it. So I'm going to recommend for anyone trying to figure out what to learn as fast as possible, whatever it's about, find people on Twitter who are doing it and follow whatever is important to them. That's my book.
Cool. Well, the second question, we'll have to adapt it as well. What category of books you don't read too much and why? So I guess you could also talk about
the category of all books.
Category that you, yeah.
No, I really love to read books. It just doesn't seem to be able to fit right now for me. But the person that I look to very much in my coaching and in my personal life the most, I think, is probably G-Paw Hill. And he is very on record as reading ecumenically. Any book, any topic, it's important to people in our field, especially who think that it's important to specialize in our field. It's especially important to these people to have interests outside of programming, outside of software, outside of computing, to nurture those, and to be aware of the narratives that are being told all over the place. So I'm a bad example. I don't get to read much like that, but at least I'm aware, and I try to read a little bit like that other ways. But so for me, I don't think there's a category of book that I would avoid. Someday I hope there are books that I have time for, and then we could try answering this question again.
Cool. Third question, what topic do you think is not discussed enough in our industry, in our communities?
The human beings who make it up. I think that's it. We all like to get lost in the work. It's part of the joy of programming, is to be adrift in the sea of the problem that you're solving and to follow the waves that lead you to the solution. That's part of the joy that makes it so wonderful. But we do it together, and we do it for other people. And that's the most important thing about it. And for some reason in our field, again, like me, I got into it to begin with thinking that it was an escape from people. At some point, I realized how career limiting and how, emotionally and to my own needs limiting that was. And I think that it's always going to be the case in our field that we need to remember to focus on the needs of the people involved, starting with ourselves. So on the bright side, that's why I will always have work. It's another way to look at it, because people will always need to remember about that. And it always needs to be somebody's job. When everybody's busy, it needs to be somebody's job to pay attention to that, because everybody else is paying attention to something else.
All right. Is there a topic that you think is discussed too much in our industry or communities?
So I was looking for work recently, and a number of people got in touch with ideas for where to work, some of them at their own workplaces. And as part of that, some of those workplaces are Silicon Valley based. And I think the amount of preparation that I was going to have to do technically for an interview, I can't say for sure that it's unwarranted. Maybe what they do there is like that, and they need to make sure that the person is capable of doing that. But in my experience, the most valuable skill any developer has is the ability to learn something quickly, because there is an infinite supply of things that we have to learn. And as long as you can learn it quickly, you will always be fine. I don't see a lot of interview processes for that. So something we talk about too much, I have a book here on how to prepare for technical interviews. I think that's too much.
Yeah. All right. Fifth question. What would be your ultimate career achievement? So something that you achieve and then you would say, okay, I can retire now because I'm at the apex of what I've done.
I wonder if I would ever give myself that permission. I can reflect on the successes I've had so far and wish for more of them. I don't think I'm creative enough to invent a new one. But the most satisfying moments I've had in my coaching career are when individual people's lives have become unequivocally better. Sometimes that's because they left the company that they were working at because they realized that better is possible and that they have to go somewhere else to get it. And I'm not particularly conflicted about that. I think companies know when they invest in growth and when they don't invest in growth, that there's always a risk of people leaving. And I'm very interested in meeting the needs of those companies, but I'm more interested in meeting the needs of the individual people that I work with. And so when that happens, when a person finds their way to, it could be that the team grows and they stay there and they're happy, and that's amazing. I love that. But it doesn't have to be like that. Whenever somebody's life improves, whenever more of them gets used at work, whenever more of them is believed and heard at work, whenever the work uses more of their creativity, is more fulfilling to them. I've had a handful of those where I'm sure of it because I've seen it happen and they've told me so. And there's nothing like it. I just wish for more of those.
All right. And the last question, what advice would you give to a younger version of yourself?
Oh boy, would he listen? No chance. Nuts. I guess I would say be patient, because that was the thing. I had no tolerance for anything that wasn't immediate. I wanted to play piano pieces that I could learn now with the technique that I have now. I don't want to invest in technique. I want to write a program with the computer that I have now, with the language that I have now. I can't wait for a long time for that to pay off. Now, as a grown-up, I guess the impulse control that a grown person can have is a little bit longer. And I just want my younger self to know you will eventually have that. And then you will be able to do things that are deeper and more invested, and they will have a longer and deeper payoff. Be patient. And he wouldn't listen.
All right, so this was the questionnaire. Now, before we close, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that we haven't touched upon?
Yeah, I guess just one thing. And I'm guessing if you're watching this, software is part of your life, a regular part of your life, and that you got into it because at least at some point it was joyful for you to do that. Um, and I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that if it's not like that, I can't make any promises because different people have different circumstances. But if it's not like that, it can at the very least be more like that. Don't give up hope on that. It's possible to have a life in software development, especially because we're so in demand, where you can be who you are, or at least more of who you are at work, and more of your creativity can go to use, more of your whole self can go to use. It exists, it's possible.
All right, and my final question always, where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter, although I've had kind of an off year, but I'm getting back to it, as Schmonz, Schmonz. They can find me on my website at latentagility.com. That's LATENT, like the agility that is already within you, waiting to sprout. You can find me, there's my podcast, Agile in 3 Minutes. That's easy to find anywhere podcasts are found. And yeah, gosh, get in touch. Happy to hear from everybody.
Cool. Thank you so much, Amitai, for this. It's been a real pleasure.
For me too.
All right, it's time to close. So you've heard, I hope, a lot of interesting information today. And thank you so much for the view. Thank you kindly for the view. Leave us a comment. Comments are, I think, the most interesting part of YouTube. Of course, we'd like, subscribes, shares, likes, and so on, but I think comments bring us together closer and we can discuss more interesting topics and we know who else to invite and so on. So leave us a comment, questions, or whatever you think about this conversation. And this is it for now. Until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.